Part 1. An Unwelcome Encounter. It was a sweltering afternoon in Cedarwood, a small town where history hung heavy in the air, and progress often felt like a distant dream. The sun baked the pavement outside the police station as Daniel Thompson parked his sleek black SUV in the reserved chief of police spot. The town was buzzing with the news of a new police chief, a black man who had earned his reputation for fairness and leadership in larger cities. His appointment had stirred both anticipation and resistance within the community. Daniel, dressed in a crisp navy blue suit, adjusted his tie and stepped out of the car. He was ready to officially take up his new role. Years of service in law enforcement had taught him to expect the unexpected. But what awaited him in Cedarwood was beyond even his wildest imaginings. Walking briskly toward the station, Daniel's keen eyes scanned his surroundings. The station itself was a relic of another era, with its faded brick exterior and an imposing flagpole standing guard at the entrance. He noticed a patrol car parked haphazardly across two spots, its engine still running. Inside, the station bustled with activity. Officers darted about, some carrying files, others engaged in conversation. Most had heard about the new chief, but few had seen him. Rumors abounded, fueled by whispers of his background and his zero-tolerance stance on corruption and misconduct. As Daniel approached the station's main entrance, Officer Brad Hargrove, a burly white officer with a reputation for being less than cordial, stepped out. Known for his quick temper and an outdated worldview, Brad was the unofficial enforcer of the old guard in Cedarwood PD. Brad didn't know who Daniel was, nor did he care to find out. Seeing a black man approaching the station, Brad's prejudices kicked in. His lip curled in disdain as he stepped directly into Daniel's path, blocking the way. "Can I help you?" Brad barked, his tone dripping with condescension. Daniel paused, taking in the officer's stance. He recognized the challenge, but remained calm. "I'm here to see the police chief," he replied evenly. Brad chuckled humorlessly. "Oh, really? And why's that?" Daniel tilted his head slightly, measuring his response. "It's official business," he said, his voice steady. Brad took a deliberate step closer, invading Daniel's personal space. "Official, huh? You lost or something? We don't take kindly to people just wandering in like they own the place." Daniel's patience was wearing thin, but he held his ground. "I assure you, I'm exactly where I need to be." Brad smirked, his disdain palpable. "Well, I don't know what you think you're doing here, but maybe you should try City Hall or wherever it is you people go to complain." It was then that Daniel noticed a few other officers nearby, watching the interaction unfold. Their expressions ranged from discomfort to amusement, but none intervened. The situation escalated when Brad, emboldened by the lack of protest from his peers, took another step forward. "Tell you what," he sneered, "why don't you turn around and walk away before you embarrass yourself?" Daniel's calm demeanor finally broke, but not in anger. Instead, he pulled out a neatly folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket and handed it to Brad. "What's this?" Brad scoffed, snatching the paper. "That," Daniel said, his voice carrying a quiet authority, "is my appointment letter. I'm your new police chief." Brad froze, his eyes darting between the paper and Daniel's face. The smug arrogance drained from his expression, replaced by a mix of disbelief and panic. Before Brad could respond, a door inside the station opened, and Deputy Chief Sandra Morales stepped out. Spotting Daniel, she hurried over, her face lighting up in recognition. "Chief Thompson," she exclaimed, extending her hand. "Welcome to Cedarwood PD. We've been expecting you." Brad's face turned ashen as Sandra's words confirmed what he now dreaded to be true. Daniel shook her hand warmly, his eyes briefly flicking back to Brad, who stood frozen, clutching the appointment letter like a lifeline. "Thank you, Deputy Chief Morales," Daniel said. "I was just getting acquainted with Officer Hargrove here." Sandra's sharp eyes darted to Brad, taking in his posture and the tension in the air. "Is that so?" she said, her voice cool. "Well, I hope the introduction was cordial." "Enlightening," Daniel replied, his tone dry but measured. Brad mumbled something unintelligible, his bravado shattered. Sandra motioned for Daniel to follow her, and together they entered the station, leaving Brad to grapple with the weight of his actions. Inside, Daniel met the rest of the department, addressing the officers with a speech that emphasized accountability, fairness, and community service. He made it clear that change was coming, and it was non-negotiable. Meanwhile, Brad stood outside, replaying the encounter in his mind. He had made an enemy of the one person he couldn't afford to alienate, and the realization stung. Little did he know, this was only the beginning. Daniel Thompson's arrival at Cedarwood PD wasn't just a change in leadership. It was a seismic shift in the culture of the department. For years, a particular faction of officers, led unofficially by Brad Hargrove, operated under the belief that their authority went unchallenged, especially in a community divided by racial and economic lines. But Daniel's presence signaled that the old ways would no longer suffice. Inside his new office, Daniel took a moment to gather his thoughts. The room, adorned with plaques and commendations from previous chiefs, felt heavy with history. He had worked hard to reach this position, but he knew the hardest part was yet to come, earning the respect of his team while dismantling the entrenched prejudices that plagued the department. Deputy Chief Sandra Morales knocked on the door, breaking his train of thought. "Chief, I've set up a meeting with the senior officers in 15 minutes. It's a chance for you to address them directly." "Perfect," Daniel said, offering a warm smile. "Thanks for coordinating that, Sandra." Sandra hesitated for a moment. "Chief, if I may—" "Go ahead," Daniel said, sensing her apprehension. "Some of the officers, they're resistant to change. Brad Hargrove, in particular, has a lot of influence here, and not always in a good way. He's already been stirring the pot since this morning." Daniel nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I expected as much. Thanks for the heads up, Sandra. I'll handle it." 15 minutes later, the senior officers gathered in the department's conference room. The air was thick with anticipation and skepticism. Some officers sat with arms crossed, their expressions guarded, while others seemed genuinely curious about the new chief. Daniel entered the room, his presence commanding attention. He stood at the head of the table, meeting the eyes of each officer before he began. "Good afternoon, everyone," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I'm Daniel Thompson, your new chief of police. I've spent my career serving in departments across the country, and I've seen firsthand what works and what doesn't in law enforcement. Let me be clear, my priority is to build trust, not just within this department, but also with the community we serve." A few murmurs rippled through the room, but Daniel pressed on. "I understand that change can be uncomfortable, but it's also necessary. Accountability, integrity, and fairness are non-negotiable under my leadership. If anyone here feels they can't uphold these values, I suggest you reconsider your place in this department." His words hung in the air like a challenge. Brad, seated at the far end of the table, shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but said nothing. After the meeting, Daniel wasted no time getting to work. He began reviewing policies, implementing new training programs, and opening lines of communication with community leaders. His goal was to make the department a beacon of justice, not a symbol of fear. But change didn't come without resistance. Brad Hargrove's bruised ego from the parking lot incident fueled his growing resentment. He saw Daniel not as a leader, but as a threat to the status quo. Rallying like-minded officers, Brad began sowing seeds of discontent. Whispered complaints about Daniel's overbearing leadership spread like wildfire, and every new policy was met with pushback. One evening, Brad took his grievances to a local bar, a favorite hangout for off-duty officers. Surrounded by his peers, he vented his frustrations. "This new guy thinks he's some kind of savior," Brad spat, slamming his beer bottle on the table. "Coming in here, telling us how to do our jobs. Who does he think he is?" "Didn't he come from one of those big city departments?" another officer asked. "Yeah, and we all know how great those are," Brad replied sarcastically. "Cedarwood doesn't need a babysitter. We've been doing just fine without him." As the night wore on, Brad's rhetoric grew bolder, but not everyone at the table shared his disdain. A few officers, younger and more open-minded, exchanged uneasy glances, silently questioning whether Brad's anger was justified or simply rooted in prejudice. A public incident. The turning point came a few weeks later during a high-profile community event. Daniel had organized a Coffee with a Cop initiative, inviting residents to meet with officers in an informal setting to discuss their concerns. The event, held in a local park, drew a diverse crowd eager to voice their opinions. One evening, a video surfaced online showing Brad in a heated argument with a group of black teenagers outside a convenience store. In the video, Brad's language was laced with racial undertones, and his demeanor was aggressive and intimidating. The video went viral, sparking outrage in the community. Protests erupted, calling for Brad's immediate resignation. Residents demanded accountability, not just from Brad, but from the entire department. Daniel acted swiftly. At a press conference, he addressed the situation head-on. The actions displayed in that video do not reflect the values of this department or the standards we hold ourselves to. Officer Hargrove has been placed on administrative leave, pending a full investigation. We are committed to ensuring that justice is served, both within our ranks and in our community. The decision was met with widespread support, but it also deepened the divide within the department. The transformation. As the investigation into Brad's behavior unfolded, Daniel doubled down on his efforts to reform the department. He met with community leaders, listened to their concerns, and implemented policies aimed at fostering transparency and accountability. He also took the time to connect with his officers, building trust and finding common ground. Slowly but surely, he began to win over even the most skeptical members of the department. Meanwhile, Brad's suspension sent a clear message. No one was above the law. The investigation revealed a pattern of misconduct, including numerous complaints from residents about Brad's behavior. Faced with mounting evidence, Brad resigned from the force, his reputation in tatters. The culmination, months later, Cedarwood PD was a department transformed. The changes Daniel had implemented weren't just policies. They were cultural shifts that brought the department closer to the community it served. Crime rates dropped, trust increased, and Cedarwood became a model for other departments across the state. At a town hall meeting, a resident stood up to address Daniel. "Chief Thompson," she said, her voice filled with emotion, "thank you for not giving up on us, for standing up for what's right, even when it wasn't easy. You've made Cedarwood a better place for all of us." Daniel smiled, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you," he said simply. "But this isn't just my work, it's ours. Together we've shown that change is possible." As the months turned into years, the changes Daniel Thompson brought to Cedarwood PD became a blueprint for departments across the country. His tenure as chief wasn't just about reforming policies, it was about transforming mindsets. The department was no longer a symbol of division, but a bridge between the police and the people they serve. Daniel's commitment to justice resonated far beyond Cedarwood. His story of resilience and leadership was featured in national media outlets, and he was invited to speak at conferences about community policing and diversity in law enforcement. One evening, Daniel received an invitation to speak at a prestigious university. The topic? Leadership in the face of adversity. As he stood before an audience of students, law enforcement professionals, and community leaders, he reflected on his journey. "I didn't come to Cedarwood to make history," he began, his voice steady and sincere. "I came here to serve, to ensure that every person, regardless of their background, feels safe and respected in their community. Change isn't easy. It requires courage, patience, and a willingness to face resistance head-on. But it's worth it, because when we work together, we can create a world where justice isn't just a word, but a reality." The audience erupted in applause, but Daniel remained humble. For him, the true measure of success wasn't accolades or recognition. It was the smiles of the children playing in Cedarwood's parks, the trust of the community members who now felt seen and heard, and the respect of his officers who had embraced the mission of serving with integrity. A new chapter. Despite his success, Daniel knew his work in Cedarwood was just the beginning. He began collaborating with other police departments, sharing his insights and helping to implement similar reforms. His efforts inspired a nationwide movement toward community-focused policing, earning him widespread admiration. Meanwhile, Cedarwood flourished. Businesses thrived, families felt safer, and the once divided community grew closer. Daniel's vision had become a reality, and his legacy was cemented not just in the department's records, but in the hearts of the people he served. But the most profound impact of Daniel's leadership was seen in the younger generation. Kids who once viewed the police with fear now saw them as protectors and allies. Young men and women inspired by Daniel's story aspired to become officers who would continue his work of bridging divides and building trust. Brad, reluctantly attending, stood off to the side, his scowl a permanent fixture. He watched as Daniel engaged with residents, listening attentively and responding thoughtfully. But then, an elderly black man approached Brad, offering a handshake. "Officer, I just wanted to say I'm glad to see changes happening in the department. It's about time." Brad bristled at the comment. "What's that supposed to mean?" he snapped. The man hesitated, clearly taken aback. "I just meant that, well, it's good to see leadership that values everyone equally." Brad's tone turned cold. "Maybe you should worry about your own business instead of ours." The exchange didn't go unnoticed. Several attendees, including Daniel, observed the interaction. Approaching calmly, Daniel intervened. "Everything okay here?" he asked, his gaze shifting between Brad and the elderly man. Brad shrugged, muttering under his breath, "Just a misunderstanding." Daniel nodded, then turned to the man. "Thank you for coming out today. Your feedback is important to us." The man smiled gratefully and walked away, but the damage was done. Brad's behavior had highlighted exactly what Daniel was working to change. Later that day, Daniel called Brad into his office. "Brad, we need to talk," Daniel said, his tone firm but not accusatory. Brad crossed his arms, leaning back in his chair. "About what?" "About how we interact with the community," Daniel replied. "Your attitude today wasn't just unprofessional, it was unacceptable. We're here to serve and protect, not to alienate." Brad scoffed. "Oh, come on, the guy was out of line." "Was he?" Daniel countered. "Or did his words challenge your perspective?" Brad's silence spoke volumes. "This isn't just about today," Daniel continued. "It's about setting an example. If you can't do that, we'll need to reassess your role here." The meeting ended with Brad storming out, but Daniel remained resolute. Change was coming, and not even the loudest voices of dissent could stop it. Part 3. The Reckoning. Brad Hargrove's disdain for Daniel Thompson continued to grow. With every policy change, every new initiative, and every ounce of goodwill that Daniel earned from the community, Brad felt his grip on the department slipping. To him, Daniel wasn't a leader. He was a threat to everything Brad believed the department should be. But the tipping point came on a crisp autumn morning. Daniel had instituted a department-wide diversity training workshop, mandatory for all officers. The training aimed to address implicit biases, promote cultural awareness, and rebuild trust between the police force and Cedarwood's diverse community. For Daniel, it was a vital step toward creating a more equitable department. For Brad, it was the last straw. In the locker room, Brad rallied a group of like-minded officers. "This is ridiculous," he fumed. "We're being treated like criminals for doing our jobs, and all because this guy wants to play politics." One officer hesitated. "Brad, it's just training. It's not that big a deal." "It is a big deal," Brad snapped. "It's the principle of the thing. He's undermining us, undermining me." By the time the training began, Brad was seething. As the instructor, a respected expert in community relations, began discussing systemic racism and its impact on policing, Brad interrupted. "This is garbage," he said loudly, standing up. "We're not racists. We don't need someone telling us how to do our jobs." The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Brad, whose face was flushed with anger. Daniel, sitting at the back of the room, stood up. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with Brad's outburst. "Brad," Daniel said evenly, "this isn't about accusing anyone. It's about understanding how we can be better, for ourselves and the community we serve." "I don't need someone telling me how to be a cop," Brad shot back. "I've been on this force longer than you've been wearing a badge." Daniel stepped forward, his voice steady but firm. "Experience doesn't excuse ignorance, Brad. If you can't see the value in learning, then maybe you're in the wrong profession." Brad stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The tension in the room was palpable, but Daniel quickly refocused the group. "Let's continue," he said, his voice unwavering. "This work is too important to let one person's resistance stop us." A public scandal. Brad's defiance didn't end there. Over the next few weeks, he became increasingly vocal about his opposition to Daniel's leadership, both within the department and in the community. He leaked complaints to local media outlets, painting Daniel as an overreaching outsider who was disrupting the department's operations. But Brad's attempts to undermine Daniel backfired spectacularly. Full circle one. Crisp fall morning, Daniel stood at the edge of Cedarwood Park, watching a group of kids playing basketball. He remembered his first day in Cedarwood, the uncertainty he had felt, and the challenges he had faced. But as he looked around, he saw a community transformed, a testament to what was possible when justice and compassion guided leadership. A familiar voice called out, "Chief Thompson." Daniel turned to see Officer Ramirez approaching, a broad smile on his face. Ramirez had been one of the younger officers who had initially struggled with the changes Daniel brought to the department. But over time, he had become one of Daniel's strongest allies and a staunch advocate for the new policies. "Just wanted to let you know," Ramirez said, "the Neighborhood Association is hosting a community barbecue next weekend. They wanted to make sure you'd be there." Daniel grinned. Wouldn't miss it for the world. As Ramirez walked away, Daniel's phone buzzed. It was a text from the mayor inviting him to discuss expanding the diversity and inclusion training program statewide. Daniel smiled. The work was far from over, but he was ready. The final lesson. As Daniel walked through the park, he reflected on everything he had learned. Leadership wasn't about power, it was about service. It was about standing firm in the face of injustice, believing in the possibility of change, and inspiring others to join the fight for a better future. And as the sun set over Cedarwood, Daniel Thompson knew that while his journey had been filled with challenges, it was also filled with purpose. Together with his community, he had turned obstacles into opportunities and transformed Cedarwood into a shining example of what justice and unity could achieve.